Good evening. This is Bill Butler again as our second installment of the running history of Memphis. And I'm honored today to have Kim Johnson, who ran at Central High School back in the late 50s, with me. And we're going to get into how the high schools in those days performed and what they wore, the events he may have participated in, and some of the people he ran across. Kim? You were there in what, now 50?
Well, I started running the sophomore year of the 10th grade, and that would have been in 1958. And the first two devoted runners that I ran with were both 2 years older than I was. They were seniors, and it was Glenn Hayes and Bud Joyner. But they were committed runners, and all of a sudden I had someone to look up to and to consider my coaches. And so I started running then for the first time. I ran in the 1 mile and the half-mile events, but then continued on the next year and the year after. And when I was a senior, I was on the 2-mile relay team, which we won the state in. Carl Awesome was on our 2-mile relay team. Carl is still alive and still around, and I see him. But anyway, it was a good experience at Central High School running track. Coach McDougall was the track coach. He also was the line coach football, and track was really an extra added attraction. If you played football, which I did, then running track was a way to stay in shape, and so that's how we really got started running track. But the track became more and more important because it was a good experience, and I enjoyed the people that we were running with. And we ran at Crump Stadium, which was right behind Central High School, but we also ran at Hodges Field. We had track meets at White Haven, and then I don't remember anything else.
Well, Glenn later became coach of the University of Memphis track team and
right.
recruited a great number of excellent athletes from Europe as well as local athletes, and only recently retired. He also was in the restaurant business, so it's a great improvement for him to go from restaurant to track. Bud was an architectural modeler and opened up a running shoe store on New York Street, just north of Central Avenue. In the back part of his house over there, which was really his studio, he built his models in, and I think his dad had owned the DeSoto Hobby Shop downtown.
His dad had the DeSoto Hobby Shop downtown, and as boys, we would all go and dream about buying models, which we couldn't buy because we didn't have any money. But after school, Bud then started making models, architectural models of buildings that were to be built. But then Bud had his studio, as Bill just said, on New York Street next to Central Avenue. And then Bud made a little bit of extra money and decided that he could parlay that into a profit by buying shoes and selling them out of his little house where his studio was. At that time, there weren't very many choices as far as shoes are concerned. Bud had Adidas shoes and maybe a few Puma shoes. It was before Nike, because this was in it was about 1971. But anyway, Bud had the shoe store, and then it became Joyner Sports. And then other people began to invest in Joyner Sports, and then he moved over to a house on Union Avenue, basically at Belvedere and Union Avenue. So that was Joyner Sports, but it was really nice to have a real, sure enough, running sporting goods store, and that was Joyner Sports. And a lot of runners invested in Joyner Sports, and so it was a good deal, big deal. There was one year, I remember, we had there was a race down on Riverside Drive, and Joyner Sports had a team. I ran, and then Bud ran, and two other people who were clerks at the Joyner Sports, and we ran downtown. We had Joyner Sports shirts, and that was our advertising. Anyway, there weren't very many runners at that time, so we were, at least in our own minds, an elite group.
Bud will be on in one of these programs later, and as an aside on this, Bud was, I bought a number of things from Bud in his little studio over on New York Street. He had a chest of drawers over there, and if you wanted a pair of shorts, I think Dolphin was the only company that really made shorts, and he would say, "What size are you?" And if I said, medium, he'd say, "Look in the third drawer over there of the chest of drawers," and you'd go over and open it up, and there'd be the Dolphin shorts, so you could pull one out. If you wanted a singlet, there weren't many of those available, more of a t-shirt type thing. He had those in a different drawer. And if you were doing well, he would ask you if you were going to race at an event, and if you were, he would let you wear his Joyner Sports singlet for that race. And after it was over, he would come back to you and he would say, "Bill, can I get that singlet back from?" It was always a very low-key thing. I helped Bud measure some courses, and I know he likes to deny this humorously, but he would put me in the back of his Plymouth Duster with an engineer's wheel, and we would drive out on President's Island, and I would sit in the back holding the wheel against the ground as he very slowly drove a course, and we would measure courses that way. Of course, every time the wheel came up and spun a little bit, we lost X number of meters off of whatever race course we were measuring. So, but it was a character.
Back to at least my high school days, which were in the late 50s, we would go out to Southwestern and watch a Southwestern track meet, and the premier runner for Southwestern was Mike Cody, and I can see to this day Mike would finish, let's just say, the mile run, and would cross the finish line and would fall to the ground. We all thought he had just died, but they'd drag him off the track, and then 10 minutes later he'd be in the half-mile race. He would revive and back again. But I can remember those days vividly, and Mike Cody was kind of our hero because he was someone who was at least faster than the rest of us.
And he will be on in some other programs too. One of the peculiarities of racing is that some of us who came later, Kim was there in the 50s, late 50s. I didn't start until the early 70s running, but we all noticed Mike Cody because of his facial expression at a finish line. He had given 125%, and it was an agony that you could only read on his face as he crossed that finish line, and it became known as the Cody Grimace. I have photographs of him at college meets later on and other events, the marathon, all with the same great agony on his face as he finished. But, as you say, he had the enormous ability to revive immediately almost.
When I came back to Memphis after having been gone for 10 years, it was about 1970, that's when we really started doing road races. And there weren't very many races, and then when there were races, there weren't very many runners in it. But there would be a 5-mile race. That was about it. But then I read in the newspaper in about 71 about a marathon that would be in Jackson, Tennessee. And I thought, well, that would be an interesting event, notwithstanding the fact that I'd never run over 5 miles in my life before then. But I did go, and I made it to about mile 15 before I crashed and burned. But then I realized that there was more to it than that, and so we started training to try to run marathons. Jim Fix published his book. Jim Fix said, if you just run a marathon, you're immune from having a heart attack. So we took that to heart. But then Jim Fix died of a heart attack while he was running a marathon, so that shot that theory. So we had to go back to resort to our original training plans. But there weren't very many marathons. There weren't very many races, really, in Memphis. But it was the start of something new, I think. And now it's there are a lot of people running a lot of different distances.
You spoke earlier about training, and you mentioned the long, slow distance, the LSD training, which has nothing to do with the hallucinogenic drug, although we certainly hoped it did in those days. But address that for a moment.
Yeah, the original training regimen was long, slow distance. Did not matter if you ran 40 miles a week, that was better than 30. But if you could run 50 miles a week, that's better than 40. Didn't matter how fast, just do the distance. And then after a few years, someone said, you know, you don't really get faster by running slow. And so that's when the interval training programs were published. So we started doing some interval training, and then we tried to figure out other things to do to make us go faster. The one theory was if you just run a marathon, not only would you be immune from having a heart attack, but then you could just eat anything you wanted to. And then people were eating pork and fat and sugar, and decided that that was not necessarily good either. So we had to start depriving ourselves of good food to try to run faster. So that was...
Training table in high school. I guess high school didn't have a training table. Were you ever subjected to dietary?
No, in high school you just ate whatever you wanted to, and we just practiced. But the longest event was a 1 mile run, so we really weren't into the long distance at all in high school. And at least my claim to fame in high school running was to win the state 2 mile relay in 1960. So, but I had run a half mile in that race, and that was about as far as we were running then, and we didn't have heart attacks, and we could eat whatever we wanted to.
And we're young. So did you run in college, Kim?
Only because I had signed up for a Marine Corps officers candidate school and would have to get in shape to go to summer camp for that. And but that was the extent of it. And so the answer is no. And then I really didn't run much, didn't run much at all in the Marine Corps other than to pass their physical tests. And then I went to law school for 3 years, and I did not run during that time. But then when I got back here in 1970 is when really the running, the road running became popular. And so I was interested in that, and it was really good. There just weren't very many people doing it. Very few races, very basically short distances. I ended up deciding after the failed marathon event in Jackson that maybe I needed to train for a marathon. And I did, and I have run in several marathons. I've run in New York twice and run in others. Actually, those are highlights. Running in a marathon is not, I don't think a steady diet of running in a marathon is, running marathons is necessarily good for you, but doing one every once in a while to just see if you can do it without dying.
The challenge.
The challenge.
And that's
yes.
that was Jackson, Tennessee, the Andrew Jackson Marathon in Jackson, Tennessee.
Yeah, that was then. And then New York was in 78 and 79, and Huntsville, Alabama, and some other places. So, but back when we first started all the road racing, there were 0 women running. It was nothing but males, and now clearly at least half of the runners are females.
At least half,
which is good. Imagine And so we have made some progress.
It's motivational. It was motivational for me. I was single when I started running, so it was always nice to see a few of the ladies out. They always seemed to be married, which was a detriment to my Casanova complex. But it certainly brought about, as you say, it improved the revolution of running. You know, when I started, there were still road races were relatively small. If you could get 30 people out, that was a nice crowd. And that was in the early 70s you were talking about. Bud had put together a series of races. He had found a sponsor with Union Planters Bank, and they had put a little money into a pot for him to draw from to put on these races. I think he had police protection in a couple of them, and this, that, and the other. But it was so early. You mentioned how many now are running in the Memphis Runners Track Club series this year?
Yeah, at least 2,000 that are training for the St. Jude Marathon. But back talking about the early races, there would be an entrance fee, but it was not raising money for a charity. It was just barely enough money to buy a couple of ribbons for the winner and the second and third place. But then the charities picked up on it, and then that increased the number of applicants because they could raise money for the charities.
As well as the entry fee, which began to explode.
Which began to increase, yes. Yeah, exactly.
I think I heard the other day someone mentioned a race that they were participating in. It may have been a triathlon, but I think it was a race, and it was $60 to enter. And for that, they were talking about their goodie bag that they would receive. It would have an actual nice athletic bag, a T-shirt, all-weather or type T-shirt, not just cotton, and a bunch of other things in there. And I thought to myself, gosh, I wonder if you went to the Academy Sports and just forked out $60, what all you could get, for that sort of money. But the charities have certainly proven that they can bring in a crowd, obviously, and that is what happened.
When I ran in the New York Marathon in 1978, there were 12,000 runners. Last year, I think, at the St. Jude Marathon right here in River City, there were something like 15,000. And so imagine that now, right here in Memphis, we have a marathon. And
well, I'll back you up on that, but here in town there's a 5K, I believe at least the half marathon and marathon, and the predominant number of people are in the half, not in the full marathon. That has a very limited number of people. I think there were like 30-something thousand this year running all the events the same day, and again, the majority, 18 and 19,000 of them were running in the half marathon.
Okay.
But other places, Peachtree, when I was first starting, Peachtree in Atlanta with a 10,000 meter run, 6.2 miles, I had 20-something thousand people. Within several years, it was 36,000 people running that race. New Orleans had the Crescent City Classic, which was sponsored by the newspaper down there, and they had 30,000 people coming out. Memphis had a problem finding major sponsors, media sponsors, in those days to help us grow a big race. The Memphis in May 10,000 meter run we had along the river, you mentioned that, was our first big race that we had numbers-wise, and it probably had 200 or so people, maybe 300 people involved in that particular race. And it died after a number of years, mainly because sponsorships were hard to sell to anyone. They couldn't figure out how to maximize their dollars in it.
On that race, my firm started putting together a team of something like 6 or 8 people, and depending on what country was being featured, then we would dress up and run like that in the race. One year, China was the country that we were featuring, and so my team each had a box and a rope, and we dressed up like a dragon, and that was how we ran the 10K. It does not that does not help with your times, that's for sure. And then one year Australia was the featured country, and we dressed up like Australians, however Australians dress up. But in any event, it was fun to try to get in the spirit of things with the country that was being sponsored. But it was a race, and it was down on the river. Good event.
And again, another oddity of that, many of us saw you guys running as the Dragon, and you were referred to as the Worm. There's a worm running, and that had been a sort of growing in other races you'd seen around the United States. There would be groups running together like that, roped together. And so the worm concept continued a couple of years after that with some relatively good runners. I think one year the average time of it was like 38 minutes for the worm to finish together. But it brought some newness to the fact that you were going out there and pound the streets for 6.2 miles.
Well, the friction among our members of our team was some of the slower runners did not want a fast runner being at the head of the worm. They wanted the slow one to be at the head.
But then again, when you saw the tail passing, there might be some competition that would grow there.
Correct.
And competition, did you compete against any of the local guys in the road race series in those days?
Oh yeah, sure. And we kept times, and in fact, one of my biggest disappointments was on my birthday when I turned 40, and I thought, now I'm going to be in this upper age group and I will improve. And so I ran the 10K or whatever it was that day, and I came in third in my new age group of 40 to 45, let's say. If I had run in the 35 to 40, I would have come in second. So it didn't. Unfortunately, the fast runners got old at the same rate that I did.
When I first started in competition, there were guys older than I was who were so much better. Pete Kraft, I don't know if you remember Pete Kraft, but I think he worked in one of the industries and was probably 10 years older than I was, and still ran so well. I remember talking to him once about how he adjusted himself in the middle of a race. If he saw someone he wanted to catch and pass, how he did it. And he said, well, I count the number of steps they're taking between lampposts, and then I count the number I'm taking between lampposts, and if they're taking more steps than I am, I know I'm going to be beaten. And I found myself going, oh yeah, okay. Melding back into the background. It was exciting in those days. It was a novelty. Not many people did it. I'm sure you had people ask you why you were running.
Right.
After I started running, people would see me. I'd lost a lot of weight. Never was heavy, but they would say, "Are you sick? Are you feeling okay? You look like you really don't feel very well." Did you ever have anybody stop you and ask you?
Well, it wasn't that, but frequently the good old boys driving by in their cars would like to yell at a lone runner as we were running down the sidewalk, and they were not complimentary comments.
I was living in North Memphis, up off North Parkway at the time, and I could run down the parkways to Rhodes College, Southwestern in those days, and then run in the grass around in the interior of Southwestern. There was no fence up in those days. And I always noted, because I was single, I'd been divorced, and I would run in the interior of the hedges at the corner of Parkway and University. And I remember one day I came barreling along there, and I noticed that some co-eds in a car parked at the light, stopped at the light, and I was sort of giving them a big smile, and my feet got caught in a big round piece of metal that I think was the interior of a car tire. Had a metal band in there that kept rigidity in there. Both my feet caught in it, and I looked like I'd been axed. I went immediately on my face, and I counted 30 before I even got up to make sure that these people had gone, and no one could see that not only that I was dusty and my face had been bruised, but I was bleeding from both knees at that point. The father-in-law later, my second wife's father told me he had the same problem with that same kind of material running in the gutters of Memphis. He would periodically catch his foot in one of them, and it would just send you tumbling. I don't know many people. He also collected nails and bolts and screws. So who's to say? I know people who collected money who claimed that they would, pick up a buck or so a week, looking down at the ground as they ran.
I collected golf balls when I used to run through Overton Park, the golf course at Overton Park, and so I collected a lot of golf balls just doing that, and that was a good training device because it took your mind off of the misery of trying to run hard.
Did you use Overton Park a great deal?
To run? Yes. Oh yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
You live in Hind Park, right by the university.
Yeah, right. So I could either run at Rhodes or at Overton Park. Yeah. The running around Rhodes, though, had the downside of each time you came around, you were tempted to stop, and so I did better going out and back. And we didn't have the green line then. We just did it on the street.
Absolutely. People thought I was bizarre. Other runners thought I was bizarre because I would run in the parkway with the grass in the parkway, which was still could be littered with glass and bottles and cans and holes, but I found it easier on my knees and hips to come to Overton Park as well as to Southwestern Roads. And later when we put together a group called the Wednesday Night Running Group, we ran from Huey's to down Tucker to into the park, and we ran some of the trails, and we came out and went through Hind Park, a portion of it, around Southwestern, and then back to Huey's, where we imbibed in a few rehydration beers. We always found ourselves in Hind Park being tooted at by people's car horns. They were, and we were such a large group, we would block people's driveways when coming home from work, and I'm sure that we were not looked upon as fairly over there as we probably thought we were.
Yeah.
Any other?
That's all I can think of. One of the downsides to being older is that it's harder to remember things, and so there's no fool like an old fool, Bill. So maybe we better stop.
I think, but that also underscores why we're doing this, and there'll be further interviews. There'll be further numbers of people. We have Mike Cody coming in, and we have some Olympians coming in. We have women. We have running store owners. We will continue this until we have enough footage that we can edit myself out and have just you guys presenting us with the memories that we still have. But thanks again, Kim. I appreciate you coming in.
Thank you.